Hey everyone, tonight we delve into something a little different, a journey that takes us into the heart of an ancient world, far from the grandeur of palaces and the glory of myth. We start with the story of a man, one of history's greatest thinkers, but also one of its most tragic figures. The city is Athens, a place of democracy, intellectual awakening, and unyielding philosophical pursuit. But this isn't the Athens you might picture from ancient texts or grand statues. This is the Athens of Socrates, a city filled with tension, political upheaval, and fierce debates where ideas collided, and the air was thick with the voices of the people. This was a time when challenging the status quo wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it could cost you your life. So before we jump in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, only if you genuinely want to hear more stories that shape our world today. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so interesting to see who's listening from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and join me as we step back into Athens, where the fate of one of the greatest minds in history was decided, not by the gods, but by the people who once called him their friend. Let's begin our journey together. Sparta, one of the most famous and feared city-states in ancient Greece, was founded on a set of principles unlike any other in the Greek world. While Athens is often remembered for its art, philosophy, and democracy, Sparta's legacy is rooted in its militaristic society. The Spartans were known for their discipline, their ironclad sense of duty, and their unwavering commitment to strength. But the story of Sparta doesn't start with its renowned warriors or its elite soldiers. It begins with the land itself, its founding, and the strict social structures that would come to define it. The origins of Sparta are steeped in myth. According to legend, the city was founded by the twin sons of Zeus, Castor, and Pollux. They were the sons of Leda, and their story would become entwined with the very soul of Sparta. However, historical records suggest that the city was originally established by the Dorians, an ancient Greek tribe. The Dorian invasion in the 10th century BCE played a significant role in shaping Sparta's future. The Dorians, though often seen as invaders by other Greek city-states, were key to Sparta's development as a militaristic society. This societal shift took place long before Sparta's military prowess would become its defining feature. It was around the 8th century BCE that Sparta began to take on its most recognizable attributes. The Spartan system of government was a mixed oligarchy, combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. At its core, Sparta was ruled by two kings, who led the military and presided over religious and ceremonial matters. However, this dual monarchy was balanced by a council of elders known as the Gerousia and an assembly of free male citizens, called the Apella. Yet it was not just the political structure that set Sparta apart. It was its devotion to military training beginning from childhood. All Spartan boys beginning at the age of 7 were subjected to the agoge, a state-sponsored education and training program designed to produce warriors of exceptional strength and discipline. The agoge was harsh and brutal, intended to forge a warrior from a child. The boys were taught not only combat skills but also how to endure suffering, live in poverty, and perform tasks in the face of adversity. Through this grueling program, only the strongest and most capable survived. The Spartans believed that only the best, the most disciplined, and the most resilient could contribute to the defense of their city-state. This militaristic society was built on the idea of self-sacrifice for the greater good of Sparta. Every Spartan's purpose was clear: to defend the state, protect their fellow citizens, and ensure the survival of the Spartan way of life. The concept of personal glory, as seen in the more individualistic cultures of Athens and other city-states, was foreign to them. Instead, their strength and honor were tied to their collective success. The Spartans' approach to war and training was incredibly effective. By the 6th century BCE, Sparta had become the dominant military power in Greece, feared by its neighbors. It wasn't long before Sparta's warriors would see their first major test, one that would shape the future of their city-state and the Greek world itself. But what led to this inevitable clash? What would it take for Sparta to cement its place as the most formidable military force of the ancient world? The 5th century BCE marked the zenith of Spartan military prowess. By this time, Sparta had become the undisputed leader of the Greek world when it came to warfare. However, the rise of Persia as a formidable empire on the Eastern Front posed a serious threat to the Greek city-states. The Persian Empire, under the leadership of Darius I and his son Xerxes I, sought to expand westward, bringing them into direct conflict with the Greeks. The Persian Wars, which began in the early 5th century BCE, would set the stage for some of the most legendary battles in history. For the Spartans, these wars would not only test their military might but would cement their place in the annals of history. The defining moment for Sparta came in 480 BCE with the Battle of Thermopylae. At the heart of this battle was King Leonidas I of Sparta. Unlike other Greek kings who would often rely on diplomacy and alliances to settle conflicts, Leonidas understood the gravity of the Persian threat. When Xerxes amassed an enormous army and advanced into Greece, the city-states were faced with a choice: to submit or fight. While many of the Greek city-states opted for diplomacy or retreated in fear, Sparta took a different approach. King Leonidas, alongside his warriors, was determined to face the invaders head-on. Sparta's elite force of warriors, the hoplites, was well trained for such a confrontation. Hoplites were heavily armored soldiers, renowned for their discipline, skill, and teamwork. Armed with a spear and a shield, they formed an unbreakable wall of defense on the battlefield, relying on the phalanx formation to defeat their enemies. The hoplites' unity and cohesion were unmatched, and they struck fear into any who dared challenge them. The location of the Battle of Thermopylae was of strategic importance. The narrow pass provided a natural bottleneck, where the Persian forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, could only attack the Greeks in small groups. This advantage was crucial as it allowed the smaller Greek force, including 300 Spartans under Leonidas's command, to hold off the Persians. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a way of life, for the freedom of the Greek city-states, and for their future. Over the course of 3 days, the Greeks held their ground. The Spartans, led by Leonidas, stood firm despite the knowledge that their numbers were insufficient to defeat the Persians. Their resolve, their bravery, and their sheer will to protect their homes became a symbol of self-sacrifice. It was a fight not for victory, but for a cause, one that resonated deeply with every soldier on the field. Unfortunately, despite their valiant efforts, the Spartans were betrayed by a Greek traitor named Ephialtes. He revealed a secret mountain path to the Persians, allowing Xerxes to flank the Greeks. Knowing that they were surrounded, Leonidas ordered the majority of the Greek forces to retreat. The 300 Spartans, along with a small group of Thespians and Thebans, chose to stay behind and fight to the death. This final stand, though ultimately unsuccessful, became a rallying cry for the Greek resistance against the Persian invasion. The death of Leonidas and his warriors at Thermopylae did not mark the end of Spartan resistance. In fact, their sacrifice fueled the Greeks' determination to defeat the Persians. Just 1 year later, in 479 BCE, the Greeks, united under the banner of Sparta, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plataea. The Persians were forced to retreat, and the Greek world was forever changed. Yet the aftermath of Thermopylae and the Persian Wars would reveal a troubling reality for Sparta. Though the city-state had proved its military superiority, its leadership in the Greek world was being questioned. The war had required great sacrifice from the Spartans, but it had also weakened their standing in a new, changing world. While Sparta remained a military power, the rise of Athens as a cultural and political leader began to shift the balance of power in Greece. After the Persian Wars, the Greek city-states, including Sparta, entered into an uneasy peace. The victory over Persia had united the Greeks, but it also exposed the fragility of this unity. The very qualities that made Sparta a military juggernaut, discipline, sacrifice, and unity, were beginning to clash with the new ways of the Greek world, where more democratic and intellectual approaches to leadership were emerging. As Athens took a leading role in the creation of the Delian League, Sparta's influence began to wane. But how would Sparta, still a military powerhouse, react to this new political landscape? Would the very values that had made them so successful in war now lead to their decline? Would Sparta's obsessive focus on military might be enough to sustain its position in the Greek world? After the Persian Wars, Sparta's reputation as the supreme military power of Greece was firmly established. However, as time wore on, the city-state's rigid adherence to its traditional values began to show cracks. While Sparta continued to dominate on the battlefield, its political and social systems were increasingly at odds with the evolving landscape of Greece. The rise of Athens as a naval and intellectual powerhouse, coupled with changing dynamics among the Greek city-states, heralded the beginning of Sparta's slow decline. In the years following the Persian Wars, the Greek world was consumed by internal conflict. Athens, empowered by its newfound wealth and prestige, led the Delian League, a military alliance formed to protect Greek city-states from Persian retaliation. The Athenians, with their powerful navy, prospered and became a cultural center of the ancient world. Sparta, on the other hand, continued to rely on its land-based military strength, remaining focused on maintaining its warrior culture. This divide would eventually lead to one of the most destructive conflicts in Greek history, the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, fought between Athens and its allies in the Delian League and Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League, lasted from 431 to 404 BCE. The war was devastating for all of Greece, but it was particularly so for Sparta. While Sparta's military might was unparalleled, it was not enough to overcome Athens' naval supremacy and the resources it had amassed through its empire. The conflict led to years of devastating siege warfare, economic strain, and political turmoil. One of the key moments in the Peloponnesian War came in 415 BCE, when Athens launched a disastrous military campaign against Syracuse in Sicily. The failure of this campaign severely weakened Athens, leaving it vulnerable to Spartan counterattacks. However, despite this opportunity, Sparta struggled to adapt to new forms of warfare. Their reliance on the hoplite infantry, while highly effective on land, proved to be less versatile when it came to naval engagements or sieging fortified cities. Sparta's inability to effectively confront these new forms of warfare was a critical factor in its eventual defeat. Despite this, Sparta did manage to secure a victory in 404 BCE when Athens finally surrendered after a prolonged siege. Sparta's brief moment of triumph was bittersweet. Though they had won the Peloponnesian War, they had done so at a great cost. The war had weakened the Greek states as a whole, leaving them vulnerable to external threats and internal strife. Sparta's victory did little to restore its former glory. The Spartan oligarchy, already strained by internal discontent and external pressures, began to crumble under the weight of the aftermath of the war. The final blow to Sparta's dominance came in the 4th century BCE, when it was decisively defeated at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE by the Thebans, led by Epaminondas. This battle shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. The defeat marked the end of Sparta's military supremacy and its position as a leading power in Greece. The Thebans, through innovative tactics and a more flexible approach to warfare, showed that Sparta's reliance on traditional methods was no longer enough to maintain its dominance. In the wake of its defeat at Leuctra, Sparta began a slow decline. Its rigid social and military systems, once the foundation of its strength, were now ill-suited to the rapidly changing political environment of Greece. The rise of Macedon under King Philip II further eroded Sparta's influence. In 338 BCE, Philip's forces decisively defeated the Greek city-states at the Battle of Chaeronea, effectively ending the independence of the Greek world and paving the way for the rise of Macedonian hegemony. Although Sparta continued to exist as a city-state after this, it was never again the military powerhouse it once was. Its once feared warriors were no longer the dominant force on the battlefield. The city-state that had once inspired awe across Greece, the land of the 300 Spartans, had faded into relative obscurity. However, Sparta's legacy as a symbol of discipline, courage, and sacrifice continued to resonate throughout history. The Spartans' unwavering commitment to their ideals became a source of inspiration for generations of soldiers and leaders. Their story, though one of eventual decline, remains a powerful testament to the impact of a single society on the course of history. In modern times, Sparta's legacy is often invoked as a symbol of military strength and resilience. The term Spartan itself has come to represent the ideals of austerity, discipline, and self-sacrifice. Yet, when we look at the full arc of Spartan history, we are reminded of the dangers of rigid adherence to tradition and the need for adaptation in the face of changing times. Sparta's failure to evolve, both in its military strategies and its social structures, ultimately led to its downfall. And in this, perhaps, there is a lesson for us today. What lessons, if any, can we take from the rise and fall of Sparta? How can we reconcile the strength of tradition with the need for change? These are the questions that echo through history, just as they continue to resonate in our modern world. Odysseus, the legendary hero of Homer's Odyssey, is often remembered for his cunning, his endurance, and his ultimate return home after 20 years of struggle. But behind the myth lies a much more complex figure, a man who, like many others in ancient Greece, was shaped by the forces of fate, family, and circumstance. While Odysseus is famous for his heroic exploits, his life began much more humbly and was marked by the same challenges that confronted many Greek leaders: leadership struggles, family dilemmas, and the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom. Born on the island of Ithaca to Laertes, the king of Ithaca and Anticlea, Odysseus was destined for greatness. But in his early life, he was far from the hero we would come to recognize in the epic Tales. His beginnings were marked not by great feats of strength or extraordinary exploits, but by the ordinary, often difficult, work of building a kingdom and navigating the complex relationships that come with leadership. From a young age, Odysseus was surrounded by conflict. As the heir to the throne of Ithaca, he was expected to carry on the legacy of his father, a king who had once been respected by his people. However, the pressures of ruling were great. Ithaca was a small island, and its influence on the larger Greek world was limited. For Odysseus, this meant that his ambitions had to be carefully balanced with the needs of his people and his kingdom. He had to forge alliances with neighboring leaders, navigate diplomatic complexities, and secure the safety and prosperity of his island. But even more challenging than his role as a king was the pressure he faced from his family. His father, Laertes, was a revered figure, a warrior in his own right, and a man whose shadow loomed large over Odysseus's early life. Odysseus had big shoes to fill, and he was aware that he would need to prove himself capable of ruling just as well as his father had. Despite these pressures, Odysseus's life as a young man was not solely defined by duty. In his youth, he was well regarded for his intelligence and eloquence, traits that would later come to define his persona. While he lacked the brute strength of some of his more famous contemporaries, such as Achilles, Odysseus's strength lay in his mind. He was known for his wit, his ability to speak persuasively, and his resourcefulness. These qualities would serve him well in the years to come, especially when he would face challenges that demanded more than just physical prowess. However, it was not until the outbreak of the Trojan War that Odysseus's true journey began. The Trojan War, one of the most famous events in Greek mythology, was fought between the Greeks and the Trojans. It was sparked by Paris, the prince of Troy, whose abduction of Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, led to a call for revenge. The war would see the involvement of many great heroes, Achilles, Hector, and Agamemnon, but it was Odysseus who would find himself at the center of one of the most iconic moments in Greek history, the creation of the Trojan horse. Before that fateful moment, however, Odysseus was faced with a decision that would shape his life forever. When the Greek kings were summoned to join the war, Odysseus was reluctant to participate. His kingdom was small and his people had little to gain from a war that seemed to offer no clear benefits. It is said that in an attempt to avoid conscription, Odysseus feigned madness. He plowed his fields with salt instead of seed, hoping to convince the Greeks that he was unfit for military service. However, his ruse was quickly uncovered by the Greek emissaries who brought his infant son, Telemachus, to the field. Seeing his child in danger, Odysseus immediately stopped his mad plowing and agreed to join the war. Though Odysseus's entry into the Trojan War was marked by a moment of personal vulnerability, it would lead to some of his greatest achievements. At the heart of the conflict, he would demonstrate his remarkable intelligence, crafting the strategy that would bring about the fall of Troy. After 10 years of fighting, it was his cunning plan of the Trojan horse that finally breached the walls of the city, leading to the Greeks' victory. The horse, a massive wooden structure, concealed a small group of soldiers who, once inside the gates of Troy, opened the city to the Greek army. This strategy, a testament to Odysseus's cleverness, would earn him great renown. Yet, despite the triumph, Odysseus's journey was only beginning. The return from Troy, which should have been a cause for celebration, turned into an arduous journey home. His decision to take a longer route, partly driven by a desire to visit the gods and seek their favor, would soon result in the most prolonged and challenging adventure of his life. But what awaited Odysseus after the war was more than just physical challenges. The war had transformed him, and he would face not just external enemies but internal ones as well. His own identity, his role as a father and a husband, and his kingdom, all would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Would Odysseus's wit and resourcefulness be enough to overcome the trials that lay ahead? And would he ever return to Ithaca, the home he so dearly longed for, or was he destined to be forever lost in the vast seas? Odysseus's return from the Trojan War was supposed to be the end of his long, grueling ordeal. After 10 years of fighting and witnessing the horrors of war, he was eager to return home to Ithaca to his wife Penelope and to his son Telemachus. However, the gods had other plans. The journey back to Ithaca, which should have been a brief one, stretched on for another decade, filled with perilous adventures and near-death experiences. At the heart of these trials was Poseidon, the god of the sea, who harbored a deep grudge against Odysseus. Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, during his attempt to escape the Cyclops island. As punishment, Poseidon unleashed his wrath, ensuring that Odysseus's journey would be long and treacherous. Every time Odysseus thought he was on the verge of returning home, Poseidon's anger would send him off course, forcing him to confront yet another obstacle. One of the first and most memorable trials Odysseus faced after the fall of Troy was the encounter with the Lotus Eaters. After sailing from Troy, Odysseus and his men landed on an island inhabited by the Lotus Eaters, a peaceful people who lived off the fruit of the lotus plant. The lotus, however, had a magical effect. It made those who ate it forget everything about their past and their purpose in life. Some of Odysseus's men, tempted by the fruit, ate it and became lethargic, losing all desire to return home. Odysseus, ever the resourceful leader, dragged them back to the ships, warning them of the dangers of forgetting their goal. Despite this early setback, Odysseus pressed on, but it wasn't long before he and his men encountered another far more dangerous creature, the Cyclops Polyphemus. The Cyclops was a monstrous, one-eyed giant who lived alone on an isolated island. In need of provisions, Odysseus and his crew entered his cave, hoping to find food. However, Polyphemus trapped them inside, sealing the entrance with a massive boulder. The giant then began to devour Odysseus's men, one by one, with no sense of mercy. Realizing that brute force would not work against the enormous Cyclops, Odysseus hatched a clever plan. He told Polyphemus that his name was Nobody, hoping to trick him into thinking that no one was involved in the attack. The Greeks then made a sharp wooden stake, and while Polyphemus was asleep, they drove it into his single eye, blinding him. When the Cyclops awoke and called for help, he could only tell his fellow giants that nobody had hurt him, making it impossible for them to aid him. As Polyphemus groped around blindly, Odysseus and his remaining men escaped by hiding under the sheep as they were let out of the cave. However, as they sailed away, Odysseus made the fatal mistake of taunting the Cyclops, revealing his true name. This act of hubris angered Poseidon even further, ensuring that Odysseus's journey would be anything but easy. From the Cyclops, Odysseus and his men sailed to the island of Aeolus, the god of winds, who gave Odysseus a bag containing all the winds, except the one that would blow him home. Unfortunately, Odysseus's men, curious about what was inside the bag, opened it while he was asleep, unleashing the winds and blowing them off course. Their hopes of returning home were dashed once again. The troubles didn't end there. After leaving Aeolus, Odysseus and his men landed on the island of the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals. The giants destroyed all but one of Odysseus's ships, and many of his men were killed. Then they sailed to the island of Circe, a powerful sorceress who transformed some of his men into pigs. However, with the help of the god Hermes, who gave him a magical herb called moly, Odysseus was able to resist Circe's magic and convince her to return his men to their human forms. Circe, impressed by Odysseus's resilience, became an ally and advised him to journey to the underworld to consult the spirit of the prophet Tiresias. The visit to the underworld was another pivotal moment in Odysseus's journey. There, he encountered the spirits of dead heroes, including Achilles, who told him that he would have a long and difficult journey ahead. Tiresias, the blind prophet, warned Odysseus of the dangers awaiting him, especially concerning the cattle of the sun god Helios. Tiresias foretold that if Odysseus or his men harmed the sacred cattle, they would face divine retribution. Odysseus, driven by desperation and the desire to return home, continued his journey. The next significant challenge was the sirens, creatures whose beautiful songs lured sailors to their doom. Forewarned, Odysseus ordered his men to plug their ears with beeswax while he himself was tied to the mast of the ship. As they sailed past the sirens, Odysseus heard their song and, overcome by curiosity, begged to be freed. His men, however, obeyed his earlier instructions and ignored his cries, ensuring their survival. The next challenge came in the form of Scylla, a six-headed monster, and Charybdis, a massive whirlpool. Odysseus, knowing that he could not avoid both threats, chose to sail closer to Scylla, sacrificing a few men to save the rest of the crew. This was yet another painful decision for Odysseus, whose leadership was marked by the constant struggle between protecting his men and ensuring their survival. Despite all these trials, Odysseus's will to return home never faltered. However, it was not just the external dangers that would shape his character. His trials on the open sea mirrored the internal struggles he faced: his desire for glory, his struggle to maintain control over his men, and his drive to fulfill his duty as a husband and father. With every challenge, Odysseus grew, learning more about his own limitations, his pride, and his mortality. But despite the many obstacles, Odysseus's homecoming remained ever elusive. Would Odysseus finally return to Ithaca, or would the gods continue to test him? And what would he find waiting for him upon his return? After countless trials and endless wandering, the time had finally come for Odysseus to return home. His journey, which had begun nearly 2 decades earlier, had been marked by gods, monsters, betrayal, and loss. Yet, even as he neared the shores of Ithaca, Odysseus found that the greatest challenge of all awaited him. The gods, who had played such a significant role in his journey, had not forgotten Odysseus. His long absence had not gone unnoticed by those who remained behind. In Ithaca, his wife Penelope had been left to wait for him, keeping faith in his return. Yet with each passing year, her suitors grew more numerous and more insistent. They had taken up residence in Odysseus's palace, consuming his wealth and seeking to claim his throne. The situation in Ithaca had become dire, and Penelope's faith was constantly tested by the pressures of time and the relentless pursuit of the suitors. Odysseus's return was not marked by fanfare or grand reunions, but by a quiet and cautious approach. The gods had finally allowed him to return, but the process would not be easy. Disguised as a beggar by Athena, Odysseus first made his way to the palace where, to his surprise, many of his loyal servants had remained, hoping against hope that their king might one day return. Among these was his faithful swineherd Eumaeus, who welcomed him with kindness, unaware of his true identity. Athena, who had been Odysseus's constant protector and guide, continued to support him, but she also reminded him that his homecoming would require more than just divine assistance. Odysseus had to prove himself once again, this time not with his strength or cunning, but with his patience, his wisdom, and his understanding of the changes that had taken place during his absence. Odysseus's first task was to reveal himself to his son Telemachus. The young man had grown up without his father and had faced his own struggles in trying to assert himself as the heir to Ithaca. Telemachus, having traveled to the mainland in search of news of his father, had returned home only to find his mother besieged by suitors. His encounter with Odysseus was both a moment of joy and disbelief. Father and son, reunited at last, made plans to rid the palace of the suitors and restore order to Ithaca. The scene that followed was one of the most famous in all of Greek mythology. In order to prove his identity, Odysseus took part in a contest organized by Penelope, who had devised a test to choose a new suitor. The contest involved stringing Odysseus's great bow and shooting an arrow through 12 axe heads, a task that only Odysseus himself could accomplish. As he strung the bow, the suitors laughed, unaware of the true nature of the man before them. But Odysseus, in a single fluid motion, completed the task with ease, revealing himself at last to the suitors. The final confrontation was swift and decisive. With the help of Telemachus and a few loyal servants, Odysseus defeated the suitors who had overrun his palace, slaying them in a brutal and calculated manner. The once great palace, filled with treachery and deceit, was now cleansed by the rightful king. Odysseus had finally returned, reclaiming his throne, his home, and his family. But even in this moment of triumph, the weight of his journey could not be overlooked. Odysseus's return had been hard won, and the violence that accompanied it left a lingering sense of unease. Penelope, too, had her doubts. She had endured 20 years of uncertainty, and though her heart longed for her husband, she was not easily swayed. Only when she tested Odysseus one last time, asking him to move their bed, which he had crafted himself, did she receive the proof she needed to know that the man before her was truly her husband. The bed, as Odysseus knew, could not be moved because one of its legs was made from the trunk of an olive tree, which was rooted firmly into the ground. This secret, known only to the two of them, convinced Penelope that her long-lost husband had truly returned. After all the trials, the violence, and the tests, Odysseus was finally reunited with his family. But this reunion, though joyful, was bittersweet. The man who had returned to Ithaca was not the same as the man who had left for Troy. The years of wandering had changed him, as they had changed Penelope and Telemachus. The hero who had once been celebrated for his cunning and bravery had now become a symbol of endurance and resilience. His journey had been a long one, and the lessons he learned along the way were far from simple. The final moments of the Odyssey reflect this complexity. Odysseus's return is not just a celebration of victory, but also a reflection on the nature of homecoming, identity, and the passage of time. After 20 years, Odysseus had finally returned to Ithaca, but the world around him had changed. His home, his family, and even his own self were no longer what they had been. And yet, despite all the changes, Odysseus found a way to reclaim his place in the world, to restore his household, and to finally put an end to the long saga that had defined his life. In the end, Odysseus's journey teaches us more than just the triumphs of a hero. It reminds us that the most difficult battles are often fought within. The journey to Ithaca was not just a quest for a physical destination, but a search for self-understanding, reconciliation with the past, and the acceptance of the inevitable changes that time brings. Odysseus's long road home is a reminder that no matter how great the trials we face, there is always the possibility of return, though the home we find may not always be the same as the one we left behind. What then does it mean to finally come home? And how do we reconcile the person we once were with the person we have become? These are the timeless questions that Odysseus's journey invites us to ponder. The city of Troy, with its towering walls and wealth, was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Situated in what is now modern-day Turkey, its fame transcended time and space, not just for its grandeur but for the monumental conflict that would arise around it, an epic war that would come to be immortalized in Homer's Iliad. The Trojan War, one of the most famous stories in Greek mythology, is often seen through the lens of heroic deeds and larger-than-life figures. Yet the origins of this war and the complex web of events that led to it are much less straightforward than the war itself. The seeds of the Trojan War were sown long before the first spear was thrown or the first ship set sail. The conflict had its beginnings in a seemingly trivial event, the wedding of Peleus, the mortal king of the Myrmidons, and Thetis, the sea nymph. The gods, in their infinite capriciousness, were invited to the wedding, but one was notably absent: Eris, the goddess of discord. Snubbed, Eris decided to wreak havoc. At the feast, she tossed a golden apple inscribed with the words "to the fairest" into the midst of the guests. Immediately, three of the most powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, claimed the apple for themselves, each believing she was the fairest. Unable to resolve the dispute among the goddesses, Zeus, the king of the gods, decided to have Paris, the young prince of Troy, act as the judge. Paris, though a prince of Troy, was more a man of beauty and charm than one of military prowess. His decision, which would be pivotal to the future of his city, was not one made lightly. The three goddesses, each eager for the title of fairest, offered Paris a tempting bribe to sway his judgment. Hera promised him power and control over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and the ability to lead the Trojans to victory in any battle. Aphrodite, however, offered Paris the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen, the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta. Paris, captivated by the promise of Helen's beauty, chose Aphrodite's offer, thus setting in motion the events that would lead to the downfall of Troy. The consequences of Paris's decision were catastrophic. His act of choosing Aphrodite's gift did not just involve a simple courtship of a woman, it directly led to Helen's abduction. Paris, guided by the goddess, traveled to Sparta where he was received by Menelaus, Helen's husband. But during his stay, Paris and Helen fell in love, and in a moment of betrayal, she fled with him to Troy. Menelaus, enraged by the loss of his wife, called upon the other Greek kings and heroes who had once sworn an oath to him to defend Helen's honor, an oath that had been made before her marriage. This oath bound the Greek leaders together in support of Menelaus's cause, and soon the might of the Greek forces was mustered to reclaim Helen and punish the Trojans for their audacity. This alliance of Greek kings, led by Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and king of Mycenae, soon became an unstoppable force. The Greeks, united by the promise of honor and the need to restore Menelaus's reputation, prepared for war. The fleet of ships set sail for Troy, marking the beginning of the long and brutal conflict that would see heroes rise and fall, and the fate of a city decided by 1,000 battles and countless lives. Yet before the Greek forces even reached Troy, disaster struck. The fleet under the command of Agamemnon was beset by unfavorable winds, and it became clear that the gods were not entirely on their side. Agamemnon consulted the seer Calchas, who revealed that the gods required a sacrifice in order for the Greeks to proceed. The sacrifice demanded was nothing less than Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. This grim choice was thrust upon Agamemnon. Faced with the overwhelming pressure of war and the expectations of his men, he made the decision to send for his daughter under the pretense of a marriage to the hero Achilles. When Iphigenia arrived, she was horrified to learn that her father intended to sacrifice her to the gods in order to secure favorable winds for the fleet. Though she initially resisted, Iphigenia ultimately agreed to her fate, understanding that her sacrifice was necessary for the survival of the Greek army. As she was led to her death, the Greek fleet was granted the winds it needed, and the ships set sail for Troy. The sacrifice of Iphigenia became one of the first tragedies of the war, a symbol of the many personal sacrifices that would follow. Agamemnon's decision, while made in the name of the greater good, would haunt him throughout the war and beyond. The Greek leaders, having put aside their doubts and personal grievances, were now committed to the destruction of Troy. Meanwhile, the Trojans, led by King Priam, prepared for the oncoming assault. Priam's city was rich in culture and wealth, but it was also divided by internal politics. The Trojans, much like the Greeks, had their own heroes. Chief among them was Hector, the son of Priam and the greatest warrior among the Trojans. Hector was a noble figure, known for his courage and sense of duty to his people. His reputation would soon be tested, as the war that had been set into motion by the fateful decision of Paris was about to engulf both sides in a conflict that would leave no family untouched, no warrior untested. The Greek army, led by Agamemnon and their greatest warrior Achilles, landed at Troy and began to lay siege to the city. The Trojan War, with its high stakes, tragic heroes, and divine interventions, had begun. The story of the Iliad, which focuses on a small segment of the war yet captures its essence, would explore the consequences of human pride, anger, and the devastating impact of war on both the victors and the vanquished. As the conflict unfolded, what would become clear is that the Trojan War was not just a battle of warriors, it was a battle of egos, of revenge, and of fate. The gods, too, played their part, intervening in the lives of mortals, sometimes for their own amusement, sometimes to serve their own interests. The war would ultimately test the honor, strength, and will of everyone involved, and in the end would leave the ancient city of Troy in ruins. But the question remained, could Troy survive the Greek assault, and could the gods, with all their power, influence the outcome of a war that seemed already fated to end in tragedy? The Trojan War was a battle of gods and men, and it was destined to change the lives of all who were involved. Yet, as the war raged on, no figure in the conflict would shape its course more than Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. His story, as told in Homer's Iliad, is one of passion, pride, and vengeance, qualities that made him both a hero and a tragic figure. Achilles was a demigod, the son of the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. From an early age, his talents as a warrior were evident. His mother, Thetis, sought to make him invulnerable by dipping him into the river Styx, but she held him by the heel, leaving that small part of him mortal. As a result, Achilles was nearly unbeatable, save for the infamous weakness in his heel, a vulnerability that would eventually lead to his demise. From the moment Achilles entered the Trojan War, his strength and courage were unmatched, and his reputation quickly grew among the Greeks. However, the relationship between Achilles and his leader Agamemnon would set the stage for one of the war's most pivotal moments, the wrath of Achilles. Achilles, despite his immense power, was not a man without pride, and this pride would soon bring him into direct conflict with Agamemnon. The catalyst for this dispute was a woman, Briseis, a captive Trojan woman whom Achilles had claimed as a prize. When Agamemnon, in a moment of arrogance, demanded Briseis from Achilles, the great warrior felt deeply insulted. To him, the taking of his prize was not just a personal affront but an attack on his honor. In a fit of rage and wounded pride, Achilles withdrew from the fighting, vowing not to return to the battlefield until Agamemnon made amends. He withdrew to his camp, leaving the Greek army without its greatest warrior. The Greeks, now without Achilles, began to falter. Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, began to push the Greeks back, and the tide of the war shifted in favor of Troy. The Greeks were struggling, and Agamemnon, seeing the dire situation, sent his emissaries to Achilles to try to reconcile with him. He offered rich gifts, including the return of Briseis, and even promised him a greater share of the spoils. But Achilles, consumed by his anger and sense of injustice, refused to return to the battle. In Achilles' absence, the Greek forces began to suffer. His closest companion, Patroclus, seeing the dire situation and knowing that the Greeks needed the aid of their mightiest hero, begged Achilles to let him wear his armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. Achilles, still consumed by his anger, agreed, but warned Patroclus not to go too far beyond the Greek lines. Yet in the heat of battle, Patroclus, filled with courage and determination, ignored Achilles' warning. He pushed the Greeks forward, fighting valiantly against the Trojans. The sight of Patroclus wearing Achilles' armor led the Trojans to believe that Achilles had returned to the battlefield, and Hector, the Trojan hero, accepted the challenge of facing him. The duel between Hector and Patroclus was fierce, but it ended tragically for the Greeks. Hector killed Patroclus, and with his death, the Greek army was thrown into even deeper despair. The loss of Patroclus was not just a blow to the Greek forces, it was a personal loss for Achilles, whose grief was so profound that it pushed him to the edge of madness. Achilles' anger now turned from Agamemnon to Hector. His grief and his sense of betrayal by the gods who had allowed Patroclus to die ignited a new fire within him. He could no longer ignore the war, nor could he allow Hector's actions to go unpunished. In a rage of grief and vengeance, Achilles rejoined the battle. His return marked a dramatic shift in the course of the war. The Greeks, now inspired by Achilles' return, rallied and began to push the Trojans back. The duel between Achilles and Hector is one of the most iconic moments in the Iliad. It is a battle not only of strength but of fate, where both heroes know that their time is limited. Hector, aware that he is facing the wrath of the greatest warrior, begs for mercy. He offers a truce, that his body be returned to his family for a proper burial if he is slain. But Achilles, driven by the desire for revenge, shows no mercy. In a final act of vengeance, Achilles kills Hector and drags his body behind his chariot, parading it before the Trojans. This brutal act, a symbol of his unyielding rage, would haunt Achilles even as he returned to his tent, victorious but empty. The death of Hector marked the beginning of the end for Troy, but it also marked a turning point for Achilles. The gods, who had played such a crucial role in the lives of both the Trojans and the Greeks, could not remain silent. The gods, especially Apollo, intervened to preserve Hector's body, preventing Achilles from dishonoring it further. Achilles, despite his rage, was ultimately forced to allow Hector's family to mourn, and King Priam, Hector's father, came to Achilles in the dead of night to ransom his son's body. In an emotional and tender moment, Priam, humbled by the loss of his son, begged Achilles for the return of Hector's body. Moved by Priam's grief, Achilles relented and gave Hector's body back to the Trojans. This moment of compassion, a stark contrast to the rage and violence that had defined Achilles up to that point, was a rare moment of redemption for the Greek hero. Achilles, who had once been a man consumed by pride and vengeance, now saw the consequences of his actions. The price of his anger had been high not only for the Trojans but for himself. His wrath had led to the death of his closest companion, Patroclus, and had prolonged the war, causing unnecessary suffering for both sides. The Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector, a somber reminder of the cost of war and the human toll it takes on all involved. Achilles, while still a hero in the eyes of the Greeks, is shown to be a flawed man capable of great heroism but also great mistakes. His journey throughout the war from wrath to redemption is one of the central themes of the Iliad. It reminds us that even the greatest of heroes are subject to the same flaws and weaknesses as ordinary men. Achilles' story, though one of personal triumph, is also a tragedy, one that demonstrates the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and the importance of compassion, even in the midst of war. The question remains, was Achilles truly redeemed by his act of mercy toward Hector's body, or had the damage already been done? And in the end, what does Achilles' wrath tell us about the nature of heroism and the cost of revenge in the mythic world? The Trojan War, a conflict lasting 10 years, is a saga filled with heroism, tragedy, and divine intervention. Yet the final chapter of this monumental war, although largely absent from Homer's Iliad, is no less significant. The story of the fall of Troy is one of the most famous episodes in Greek mythology, but it is also a tale of cleverness, deceit, and the inevitable fate of a city that had been doomed from the start. The war, which had begun with the abduction of Helen, had taken a heavy toll on both sides. The Greeks, despite their victories and their mighty warriors, had made little progress in their siege of Troy. The city's walls were high and impregnable, and the Trojans, under the leadership of King Priam and his son Hector, fought fiercely to defend their home. The stalemate seemed endless, and the Greeks, weary of war, began to question whether they would ever be able to breach the walls of Troy. It was at this moment that the Greeks, led by Odysseus, devised one of the most famous and cunning strategies in the history of warfare, the Trojan horse. The Greeks, tired and desperate for a way to end the conflict, pretended to abandon the siege. They constructed a massive wooden horse hollowed out to contain a small group of their finest soldiers. The horse was left at the gates of Troy, with a note indicating that it was an offering to the gods, a gift meant to ensure safe passage home for the Greeks. The Trojans, believing that the Greeks had finally given up and sailed away, were initially suspicious of the horse. However, the cunning Greek soldier Sinon, who had been left behind to deceive the Trojans, convinced them that the horse was a sacred offering to the gods. He spun a tale of how it was a gift meant to bring Troy good fortune, and that if the horse were brought into the city, the gods would favor them and grant them victory. The Trojans, eager to celebrate their apparent victory and the end of the war, brought the horse into their city. That night, as the Trojans slept, the Greek soldiers hidden inside the horse emerged. They opened the gates of Troy to allow the rest of the Greek army, who had secretly returned under cover of darkness, to enter the city. The Greeks swiftly attacked, and the Trojans, unprepared for battle, were caught off guard. The city that had withstood 10 years of siege was now overwhelmed in a single night. The fall of Troy was brutal. The Greeks, now free to exact their revenge, slaughtered the Trojan defenders and civilians alike. Priam, the noble king of Troy, was killed in the temple of Zeus, while his wife Hecuba was taken as a captive. Hector's wife Andromache was left to mourn her husband's death and face an uncertain future as a slave. The city was looted, its treasures stolen, and its once great walls reduced to rubble. Among the most tragic moments of the fall of Troy was the death of Astyanax, Hector's young son. In one of the most heart-wrenching scenes, the Greek warrior Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, threw the child from the walls of the city, ensuring that Troy's bloodline would be erased. This act, though a part of the chaos of war, served as a tragic symbol of the price of victory, a reminder that even the youngest and most innocent were not spared the consequences of the conflict. The destruction of Troy, however, was not merely a physical conquest. It was the end of an era. The mighty city, which had stood as a symbol of wealth and power, was now in ruins. The once great leaders and warriors of Troy, Hector, Priam, and the others, were no more, and the city's fate had been sealed by the very gods who had shaped its history. The gods themselves, too, had played their part in the destruction. Apollo, who had once favored the Trojans, could do nothing to stop their fall. Even the gods' wills could not alter the course of fate that had been set in motion. Yet despite the victory, the Greek heroes did not return home unscathed. The gods, ever watchful of the consequences of human actions, ensured that even the victors would suffer. After the fall of Troy, the Greeks began their long journey home. Some, like Odysseus, would face even more trials and tribulations, while others, such as Agamemnon, would meet grim fates. The journey home would be fraught with further suffering, as the gods continued to mete out their punishments for the bloodshed that had occurred. For the Trojans, the destruction of their city marked the end of an era of greatness. Troy's fall was not just a military defeat, it was the destruction of a way of life, a civilization that had been one of the finest in the ancient world. The city would never rise again, and its legacy would be remembered only in the stories of the survivors, the Greeks who returned home, and the poets who immortalized its tale. The fall of Troy, though devastating, also marked the beginning of a new chapter in history. The Greeks, victorious though they were, had paid a heavy price. The destruction of Troy, the death of so many heroes, and the bitter consequences of war served as a powerful reminder of the cost of human conflict. The Iliad may end with Hector's funeral, but the fall of Troy itself, the final act of the war, is a tale of loss, suffering, and the inescapable power of fate. What then does the fall of Troy teach us? Is it a story of triumph or tragedy? The gods played their part, but it was human pride, ambition, and vengeance that sealed Troy's fate. Perhaps in the end, the true lesson of the Trojan War is that even in victory, there is no true escape from the consequences of the choices we make. The city-state of Athens stands as one of the most influential civilizations in the history of the Western world. Among its many contributions to the course of history, none is as enduring or as significant as the development of democracy. But the Athenian experiment in democracy was not born overnight. It was the result of a long evolution of political thought, social dynamics, and intense philosophical debate. Its birth marked a dramatic shift in governance, moving from the rule of kings and aristocrats to a new system in which power was vested in the hands of ordinary citizens. The origins of Athenian democracy trace back to the 6th century BCE, during a period of political instability and social unrest. Athens, like many other Greek city-states, was originally ruled by a series of kings. By the time of the 7th century BCE, however, kingship had given way to aristocratic rule. The elite families controlled the land and the resources, and power was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy and influential individuals. This aristocracy, though relatively stable, had created growing discontent among the poorer classes, who found themselves excluded from political power and burdened with taxes and military service. In response to these tensions, several attempts at reform were made. The first significant step toward Athenian democracy came in the early 6th century BCE with the efforts of the statesman Solon. Solon was appointed as an archon, one of the chief magistrates of Athens, with the task of resolving the city's internal crises. At the time, Athens was experiencing political turmoil due to the growing gap between the rich and the poor, as well as the increasing indebtedness of farmers and the widespread practice of debt slavery. Solon's reforms were revolutionary for their time. He enacted laws that aimed to ease the burdens on the poor and reduce the power of the aristocracy. One of his key reforms was the cancellation of debts, which freed many Athenians from the threat of debt slavery. He also restructured the social classes based on wealth rather than birth, allowing for more political participation from the lower classes. This marked the beginning of a shift from aristocratic rule to a more inclusive system of governance. However, despite Solon's reforms, Athens was far from a democracy. The political power still largely rested in the hands of the wealthy elite, and the lower classes, while somewhat alleviated from their debt burdens, still lacked direct political influence. The next critical step came in the 5th century BCE, during the leadership of Cleisthenes, another reformer who would lay the foundations for true Athenian democracy. Cleisthenes' reforms in 508 BCE are often seen as the beginning of the true democratic experiment in Athens. He introduced a new political structure that divided the population into 10 tribes, each based on geographic location rather than aristocratic lineage. This was designed to weaken the power of the traditional aristocratic families and ensure that power was spread more evenly across the population. Cleisthenes also created the Boule, a council of 500 citizens chosen by lottery, which played a central role in decision-making. This council, along with the ecclesia, the assembly of all male citizens, gave the people a direct voice in the governance of Athens. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens, rather than just the elite, could participate in the political process. Cleisthenes' reforms laid the groundwork for a system of government in which political power was shared by all free male citizens, regardless of their wealth or birth. However, it's important to note that this democracy was limited in scope. Women, slaves, and non-citizens had no political rights, and the full participation of the citizenry was still restricted to a relatively small portion of the population. Nevertheless, the reforms of Cleisthenes marked a dramatic shift toward a more inclusive system of governance. The next key figure in the development of Athenian democracy was Pericles, who rose to power in the mid-5th century BCE. Pericles was a charismatic leader who expanded upon the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes, further solidifying Athens as a center of democratic governance. During his leadership, Athens saw the height of its political power and cultural influence, often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens. Pericles expanded the role of the ecclesia and increased the power of the people by allowing citizens to participate in public life and receive pay for jury service. This made it possible for even the poorest citizens to engage in political affairs, increasing the democratic nature of Athens. Under Pericles, Athens also saw the construction of monumental projects such as the Parthenon, the grand temple dedicated to the goddess Athena. The city flourished both politically and culturally, with advancements in art, philosophy, and theater. Democracy in Athens became a model of political participation, where the decisions of the state were made by the citizens themselves, not by a ruler or a small elite. Yet as Athens grew in power and influence, so too did the challenges to its democratic ideals. The Persian Wars had united the Greek city-states, and Athens had played a central role in the defeat of Persia, particularly in the Battle of Marathon and the naval victory at Salamis. However, after the Persian threat had passed, Athens found itself increasingly at odds with its neighbors, particularly Sparta. This led to the Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict that would have lasting consequences for Athens and its democracy. The Peloponnesian War, fought between the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, was a devastating conflict that lasted from 431 to 404 BCE. The war tested the strength of Athenian democracy, as the city faced not only military defeat but also internal political instability. The war ended with the defeat of Athens, and in the aftermath, the democratic system was temporarily overthrown by an oligarchic coup known as the 30 Tyrants. However, the democratic spirit of Athens was not easily crushed, and after the fall of the 30 Tyrants, democracy was restored in 403 BCE. While Athenian democracy was far from perfect, with limitations on who could participate in constant struggles for power, it remains one of the most important political experiments in history. Its ideals of equality before the law, political participation, and public debate influenced political thought for centuries to come and laid the groundwork for the development of democratic systems in the modern world. As we reflect on the origins of democracy in Athens, we must ask, what can we learn from this ancient experiment? How did the tensions between democracy and oligarchy shape the course of history? And, in the context of the ancient world, what made Athenian democracy so revolutionary? Following the reforms of Cleisthenes and the further expansion of democracy under Pericles, Athens entered what is commonly referred to as its Golden Age, a period of cultural, intellectual, and political flourishing. This era, which spanned much of the 5th century BCE, was characterized by the full flowering of Athenian democracy, with the citizenry deeply involved in the political process, as well as unprecedented advancements in art, philosophy, and theater. Under Pericles, Athens became not only the center of democracy, but also a beacon of cultural and intellectual achievement. Pericles was not just a political leader, but also a visionary who recognized that the strength of Athens lay not only in its military and economic power, but also in its commitment to the arts and philosophy. His leadership transformed Athens into a hub of creativity and intellectual exploration, and it was during this period that some of the greatest minds in history emerged, including philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. One of the most notable aspects of this golden age was the dramatic expansion of Athenian democracy. Pericles enacted policies that expanded the role of ordinary citizens in government. For instance, he introduced the practice of paying citizens to serve on juries and in public office, which allowed even the poorest Athenians to participate in political life. This ensured that Athenian democracy was not just an ideal, but a functioning system that included people from all walks of life. While the political system was still limited, women, slaves, and non-citizens had no rights. It was revolutionary for its time. The ecclesia, the assembly where citizens could vote on laws and policies, became the heart of the democratic process. Thousands of citizens would gather to discuss and vote on key issues, from war to taxation, making decisions directly through majority rule. Athens also saw the development of the Boule, a council of 500 citizens chosen by lottery, which prepared the agenda for the ecclesia and oversaw the administration of the state. This system of randomly selecting officials rather than allowing wealthy aristocrats to hold power was one of the most innovative aspects of Athenian democracy. It helped ensure that political power was spread as evenly as possible among the citizens, regardless of their wealth or social standing. Yet, it was not just the political innovations that defined Athens during this period. The Golden Age also saw the construction of monumental architectural works that still stand as symbols of Athenian achievement. The most famous of these is the Parthenon, the grand temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, built atop the Acropolis. The Parthenon is not just an architectural marvel, it is a symbol of the greatness of Athens itself, its democracy, its cultural sophistication, and its devotion to the gods. Athens also became the birthplace of Western philosophy during this time. Philosophers such as Socrates questioned the nature of justice, knowledge, and the good life, laying the groundwork for the philosophical traditions that would shape Western thought for centuries. Socrates, in particular, challenged the traditional ways of thinking, encouraging people to question everything, to seek wisdom through dialogue and debate. His method of inquiry, known as the Socratic method, is still used in classrooms and courtrooms today as a means of engaging in critical thinking. The Golden Age of Athens also saw the development of dramatic arts, with playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides creating some of the most important works of Western literature. Theatrical festivals like the City Dionysia became central to Athenian life, where playwrights competed to showcase their tragedies and comedies. These plays, often performed in large outdoor theaters, were not just forms of entertainment, but also served as a means of exploring important political and social issues, such as justice, the role of the gods, and the responsibilities of the citizenry. The flourishing of the arts, philosophy, and political participation was a testament to the vibrant intellectual environment fostered by Athenian democracy. The people of Athens were not merely passive recipients of power, they were active participants in shaping their society. This engagement led to the development of ideas that have influenced the course of Western civilization, ideas about democracy, citizenship, and the role of the individual in society. However, despite the outward prosperity of Athens during the Golden Age, there were significant challenges that would eventually undermine the city-state's political system. While democracy had allowed for unprecedented freedom of speech and participation, it also introduced instability. The constant involvement of the people in government decisions led to frequent shifts in policy, and the collective nature of democracy sometimes resulted in hasty or poorly thought-out decisions. The most notable example of this came during the Peloponnesian War, where the Athenians, swayed by the populist rhetoric of their leaders, made decisions that ultimately led to their downfall. The Peloponnesian War, fought between the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, tested the strength of Athenian democracy. The war, which lasted from 431 to 404 BCE, was devastating for both sides. Athens, despite its democracy and cultural achievements, was unable to maintain its dominance in the face of a determined Spartan enemy. The war strained the democratic system, as leaders like Alcibiades and Cleon pushed for aggressive tactics that often went against the best interests of the city-state. The democratic system was forced to make difficult decisions, and at times, the people's choices proved to be disastrous. In the final years of the war, internal political turmoil also contributed to Athens' decline. A short-lived oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants briefly took control, undermining the democratic ideals that had once defined the city. After the defeat in the Peloponnesian War, Athens was left weakened and divided, its political system in disarray. Yet despite the ultimate failure of Athens in the war, the ideals of Athenian democracy endured. The influence of Athens on the political and cultural development of Western civilization is immeasurable. The core ideas of democracy, equality before the law, and the role of the citizen in governance continued to inspire future generations, particularly during the Renaissance and in the development of modern democratic systems. As we look back on the golden age of Athens, we must ask, what made Athenian democracy so unique in the ancient world? How did the political participation of ordinary citizens shape the course of history? And what lessons can we draw from the successes and failures of Athens in the context of our own political systems today? The decline of Athens and the eventual collapse of its democracy can be traced back to the turbulent years of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that drained the city's resources, tested its political stability, and left it vulnerable to external and internal strife. Despite Athens' rich cultural achievements and groundbreaking political systems, its ultimate downfall reveals the limitations of Athenian democracy and the fragility of any system dependent on constant popular involvement. The Peloponnesian War, which raged from 431 BCE to 404 BCE, was the most significant event in Athenian history during the Golden Age. Initially, Athens had the upper hand with its powerful navy and rich resources. However, the war stretched on for decades, and the strain it placed on Athens' democratic system was profound. As the war dragged into its later years, Athens faced a series of political crises that exposed the flaws in its democratic framework. One of the most significant problems was the frequent turnover of leaders. The direct democracy of Athens allowed for powerful orators and populist leaders to gain sway, sometimes leading to rash or unwise decisions based on emotional rhetoric rather than sound judgment. Leaders like Alcibiades, whose ambitious plans often lacked foresight, and Cleon, whose bellicose speeches advocated for aggressive strategies, were emblematic of a system where political decisions could be heavily influenced by the whims of the populace. In addition to the instability of leadership, the war also introduced deep divisions within the Athenian society. The division between the pro-war and anti-war factions created internal conflicts, leading to moments of political unrest. In 411 BCE, a coup by oligarchic forces briefly displaced Athens' democracy, ushering in a short-lived government of the 30 Tyrants, who ruled with cruelty and without the consent of the people. This period of oligarchy was a direct challenge to the ideals of Athenian democracy, though it was short-lived. After the fall of the 30 Tyrants, democracy was restored, but Athens never fully recovered from the wounds inflicted by the war. By 404 BCE, Athens was defeated by Sparta, and the fall of the Athenian Empire marked the end of its political hegemony. The final defeat in the Peloponnesian War left Athens severely weakened. The city, once the leader of the Greek world, was now a shadow of its former self. The Athenian democracy, which had been tested so thoroughly during the war, could not recover its former glory. The political system, still marked by factionalism and instability, had proven to be unsustainable in the face of prolonged conflict. Though Athens was defeated and its democracy temporarily weakened, the ideals of Athenian democracy did not vanish. Even in the face of defeat, Athens continued to inspire future generations. The city's intellectual legacy, the development of the democratic system, and the cultural achievements of the Golden Age remained influential. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens would slowly rebuild, but it would never again return to the heights it had reached in the 5th century BCE. The death of Athenian democracy did not mark the death of the principles of democracy themselves. The political ideals of Athens found new life during the Hellenistic period, and later during the Renaissance, when thinkers and leaders looked back to Athens as a model for governance. The democratic experiments of Athens became the intellectual foundation for modern political thought. influencing the development of democratic systems around the world. In modern times, the legacy of Athens has shaped our understanding of democracy, equality, and citizenship. The principles of participation in governance, justice before the law, and the collective decision-making that defined Athenian democracy are foundational to many of the democratic systems in place today. Yet, the Athenian experience also serves as a cautionary tale. The vulnerabilities that led to the downfall of Athenian democracy, political instability, populism, and factionalism, continue to resonate in the modern world. Despite its fall, Athenian democracy's influence endures. The city-state's commitment to public participation and the rule of law laid the groundwork for the development of modern democratic institutions. Today, Athens is remembered not just for its failures, but for its remarkable achievements in shaping the political landscape of the Western world. As we reflect on the rise and fall of Athenian democracy, we must consider its lasting impact. How did Athens' experiment with democracy shape the world that followed? What lessons can we learn from its successes and failures as we grapple with the complexities of democracy today? The story of Athens is not merely a tale of political rise and fall, but a testament to the resilience of ideas, the enduring nature of intellectual achievement, and the continuing search for a government that represents the will of the people. With the decline of Athens as a dominant force in the ancient world, its democratic legacy lived on in the hearts of future generations. The questions of governance, justice, and the role of the citizen would continue to evolve and inspire, shaping the trajectory of political thought for centuries to come. Socrates, one of the most renowned figures in Western philosophy, lived a life that was anything but conventional. Born in Athens around 470 BCE, he grew up in a society that was beginning to undergo rapid political, cultural, and intellectual changes. Athens at the time was a flourishing democracy, but it was also a city fraught with tension. The Peloponnesian War had recently ended in defeat for Athens, and the political environment was unstable. It was in this turbulent context that Socrates began to develop his ideas and his approach to philosophy. Unlike the philosophers before him, who focused largely on cosmology and the nature of the physical world, Socrates turned his attention to the human condition. His method of inquiry, now known as the Socratic method, involved asking probing questions designed to challenge assumptions and stimulate critical thinking. Socrates was not interested in giving answers. Rather, he wanted to encourage his fellow Athenians to think deeply about their beliefs and to question the validity of those beliefs. His goal was not to provide knowledge, but to expose the ignorance that often lies beneath the surface of accepted truths. Socrates became famous for his unconventional approach to learning. He did not write down his ideas, nor did he hold formal lectures. Instead, he engaged in daily conversations with the people of Athens, often stopping strangers in the marketplace or at public gatherings to question them about their understanding of topics such as justice, virtue, and the nature of the soul. His probing questions would lead his interlocutors into intellectual dead ends, forcing them to acknowledge their own lack of knowledge. Socrates believed that wisdom came not from knowing the answers, but from recognizing how little one actually knew. This method of questioning and exposing ignorance made Socrates both admired and controversial. Many of the young men of Athens were drawn to him, finding in his approach a refreshing challenge to the conventional wisdom of the time. However, his relentless questioning of authority and tradition also made him enemies, especially among the political and intellectual elites of Athens. They saw Socrates as a disruptive force, undermining the values and institutions that held their society together. Socrates' method was also deeply democratic in its essence. By engaging ordinary people in his dialogues, he made philosophy accessible to the masses. In a city that prided itself on its democratic ideals, Socrates questioned the very foundation of those ideals. He questioned the competence of the political leaders and military generals, and he challenged the ideas of wisdom and virtue upheld by the Athenians. His willingness to confront authority directly and to question accepted truths made him a polarizing figure. The growing tension between Socrates and the Athenian authorities was further exacerbated by the political situation. In the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was in a period of recovery, and the political atmosphere was charged. Socrates had on occasion been associated with some of the more controversial figures of the time, including Alcibiades, the ambitious and often reckless Athenian general, and Critias, a leader of the 30 tyrants who briefly overthrew Athenian democracy. Though Socrates himself had not been involved in the tyranny, his association with these figures raised suspicion about his political loyalties. To many, Socrates' constant questioning of authority and tradition seemed to align him with those who had overthrown the democratic government. But perhaps the most crucial factor that led to Socrates' downfall was his influence on the youth of Athens. His followers, including Plato and Xenophon, would go on to become some of the most important philosophers in history. But at the time, many saw the young men who gathered around Socrates as a threat to the status quo. These young men, who were inspired by Socratic ideas, were often seen as radical and subversive. The authorities in Athens feared that Socrates was corrupting the youth, leading them away from traditional values and undermining the foundations of the city's democratic society. This fear, combined with Socrates' growing unpopularity among the political elite, eventually led to his trial. In 399 BCE, Socrates was charged with impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. These charges, though vague, were serious enough to bring him to trial. In Athens, a trial was a public event, and the entire city could participate by voting for the outcome. Socrates' trial would become one of the most famous in history, not because of the crimes he was accused of, but because of the way he responded to those accusations and the way he defended his philosophy. Socrates was given the opportunity to defend himself in front of a jury of his peers. His defense, as recounted by Plato in the Apology, is a profound statement of his philosophy and his commitment to the search for truth. Socrates did not try to appeal to the jury's emotions or beg for mercy. Instead, he boldly asserted that he had not corrupted the youth, but had instead encouraged them to think for themselves, to seek wisdom, and to question authority. He argued that his actions were in service of the gods, as he believed his philosophical work was a divine mission. Socrates believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, and he claimed that his constant questioning was necessary to lead the city toward a better understanding of virtue and truth. In his defense, Socrates also acknowledged that he had not been popular, but he argued that this was not a crime. He famously said, "I am not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world." This statement reflected his belief that his duty to pursue truth transcended the politics of Athens. His insistence on living according to his principles, no matter the consequences, was a testament to his character and his unwavering commitment to philosophy. Socrates' defense, though deeply intellectual and eloquent, did little to sway the jury. In the end, he was found guilty by a narrow margin, and the jury had to decide on his punishment. Socrates was given the option of choosing a punishment for himself, and his suggestion was one that shocked the court. Rather than proposing exile or a lesser sentence, Socrates suggested that he should be rewarded for his service to Athens, given free meals for life, as a reward for his contributions to society. When this suggestion was rejected, Socrates proposed a fine, which was also rejected. Ultimately, the jury sentenced him to death by drinking hemlock, a poison. As Socrates awaited his execution, he remained calm, even philosophical, about the prospect of his death. He believed that death was either a peaceful eternal sleep or a transition to another life, where he would continue to engage in philosophical dialogue with great minds of the past. His final words, according to Plato, were to his friend Crito, asking him to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, for his release from the illness of life. Socrates' acceptance of death, his steadfastness in his principles, and his unwavering dedication to truth have made his death a defining moment in the history of philosophy. In the aftermath of Socrates' death, Athens would be left to grapple with the loss of one of its most important citizens. Socrates' ideas and teachings lived on through the writings of his disciples, especially Plato, who would go on to establish the academy and influence generations of thinkers. Despite the injustice of his execution, Socrates' death symbolized the power of philosophy to question the status quo and to challenge conventional wisdom. His legacy endures as a cornerstone of Western thought, and his commitment to truth, virtue, and intellectual inquiry continues to inspire philosophers, political thinkers, and citizens today. Socrates' death raises a profound question. How should a society treat those who challenge its beliefs, especially when they do so in the pursuit of truth? The trial and execution of Socrates serves as a reminder that wisdom often comes at a great cost, and that the pursuit of truth, no matter how unpopular, is a noble endeavor. But in the end, did Socrates' death signify a victory for the truth, or was it a tragic reminder of the dangers of questioning authority in a world that is not always ready for answers?